Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at heart anatomy. So I am actually going to be working from pages 73 and 74 in your lab guide, which are your heart gross anatomy structures that you'll be seeing in lab with your instructor. So to begin with, we want to make sure that we're looking at the heart in correct anatomical position. So if this were my heart, first of all, I'd be very big-hearted, right? But this would be the right side and this would be the left. Okay, so on this particular heart model, the right side is illustrated by the blue chamber at the top and the sort of ugly orange yellowy chamber on the left. All right, so let's get some of the basic terminology out of the way. When you think of apex, if you're looking at the apex of a mountain, you're typically going to be looking at the pointed upper portion. Okay, so apex typically is the top. And the base of something is usually at the bottom. Well, forget all of that when you're thinking about the heart. We do things differently in anatomy, but you figured that out already, right? So the apex is the pointed portion of the heart that is at the bottom. It is pointed somewhat to the left when it's in the human body. So think apex and point. Put your two P's together, apex and point. And the base is the broad portion at the upper part, the superior portion of the heart, and you have these large vessels that are associated with the base. So apex is the point, base is the broad portion at the top. Now, on this particular model, you can't see the cardiac sac or the pericardium. That is going to be the membranes that surround the heart. But if you think back to your 201 class and you learned about serous membranes, remember the serous membranes are going to either line the surface of an organ or line the cavity that the organ is in. So on the surface of an organ, remember, you have visceral membranes. Lining cavities, you have parietal membranes. Then the cavity is the space between them. So let's use my hand as an example to illustrate the pericardial sac. If my hand is the heart, we're going to have a visceral pericardium lying on the surface of that heart, just like you put it wrapped in saran wrap and shrink wrapped it really tightly. So your visceral pericardium is also known as your epicardium. Epi means upon, and it lies on the surface of the heart. Lining the cavity, you're going to have that parietal pericardium. So if this is the heart, we've got the visceral, then we've got pericardial fluid filling the cavity, and the parietal pericardium lining the cavity itself. We have one other part of the pericardium, and that is the tough outer fibrous pericardium that is the protective layer. So if we start with the heart, you've got the visceral pericardium, also called epicardium. You've got the pericardial space, the cavity, which is filled with fluid. Then you've got the parietal pericardium lining the cavity and the tough outer fibrous pericardium. All right, so we've got the pericardial sac now. Let's move on to some of our structures. The heart wall has three layers as well, one of which we've already talked about, and that is the epicardium or the visceral pericardium, that outer layer. The inner layer of the heart, the inner lining, you should have heard that already, endocardium, is the inner lining of the heart. It's made of epithelial tissues, and it is continuous with all of the blood vessels that go throughout your body. Between those two, you have the myocardium. Myo should alert you to the fact that we're talking about muscle. So the muscle of the heart is the myocardium. So if we look here where we can see inside the heart, this outer part, the outer layer, is your epicardium. The inner layer is the endocardium, and all of the muscle fibers between represent your myocardium. So the muscle is the myo. Now let's talk about the chambers that make up the heart. The heart actually is a two-sided pump, with the right side of the heart being responsible for your pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary should alert you to the fact that we're referring to lungs. So your pulmonary circulation is going to pump blood out to the lungs. When it comes back, it's coming into the left side of the heart, which is responsible for your systemic circulation. Systemic means the rest of the body. So on the right side, we have the right atrium, which is your receiving chamber on the right. On the left side, you have the left atrium, which is the receiving chamber on the left. Blood comes back in from wherever it's coming from into your receiving chambers, which are your atria. Now notice I changed the way I said that. Singular is an atrium. Right atrium, left atrium. The plural is atria. So be sure that you spell that right on your lab test. So deoxygenated blood comes into the right atrium as it's returning from the body. It's then going to be pushed through this vessel or through this valve that we'll name in a few minutes into the right ventricle. On the left side, oxygenated blood comes back from the lungs into the left atrium through this valve into the left ventricle. Your ventricles are the lower chambers and they're your ejecting chambers. So they push the blood out of the heart. All right, let's go over those chambers again. Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. So far, so good? All right. Now, you should have heard of a septum before. Where would you find a nasal septum? Yeah, that one's pretty easy, right? Divides the two cavities of the nose. So a septum is a dividing wall. So we also have septi that are going to divide our chambers. So you have an atrioventricular septum. Remember atrium and ventricle? Atrioventricular, the wall that divides the atria and the ventricles. Your valves are embedded in the atrioventricular septum. Now, if you took an interstate from Alabama to Tennessee, you would be going between the two states, correct? So interstate takes you between. Inter should let you know that we're talking about something between. So interventricular, where would you look for that? I knew you knew it, between the ventricles, right? So the interventricular septum is the strip of myocardium that divides the ventricles. Now there's also an atrial septum that's not on your list, but your instructors may have you know that because you'll talk about one of the structures found there in the fetal circulation. So that's going to be the wall that separates the atria. All right, so far so good. Let's talk a little bit about these valves now. In that atrioventricular septum, we have what are known as atrioventricular valves. Now this one's broken, but you still get the picture, right? So these are atrioventricular valves. A valve is something that allows passage or prevents passage of something from one area to another. So these either allow or prevent blood flow from the upper to the lower chambers or vice versa. We want to allow blood flow from the upper chambers into the lower chambers, from the atria into the ventricles. But we don't want these valves to allow blood to backflow. So when the ventricles are ejecting blood out, these valves are going to close so that the blood goes out of the heart and not back up into your atria. So these are unidirectional atrioventricular valves. Sounds like a mouthful, but if you think about what the terms mean, it's not quite so bad. On the right side, blood comes into the right atrium and goes through the tricuspid valve. It's called tricuspid because it has three cusps. A cusp is like, if you think about your molars, your back teeth, where they've got the little humps on them, those are cusp. So the tricuspid valve has three cusps. It's the atrioventricular valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. On the left side, we have the bicuspid valve. Bet you could figure out how many cusps are on that one, right? You better be able to by now. So between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have the bicuspid valve. This is also commonly called, and you'll probably hear this more in practice, the mitral valve. All right, so right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle. Left atrium, bicuspid valve, left ventricle. All righty, where are we at now on our list? Let's talk about some of our major vessels now. You have probably all heard of the superior and inferior vena cava before. And those terms, superior and inferior, should also be familiar to you. Superior refers to, that's it, above, over. Inferior is below or under. So your vena cava are the two main vessels that are going to bring blood back into the heart. Now we're still referring to systemic circulation. So as blood goes out to the body, it's going out there and dropping off oxygen, bringing back CO2, carbon dioxide, that waste product, so we can take it out to the lungs. But if we're going to take it out to the lungs, we've got to get it to the pump first. So the right side of the heart, remember, is the pulmonary circulation, the pulmonary pump. So we're going to bring deoxygenated blood back from the areas of the body through your vena cava. So here we have the superior vena cava, and on the inferior surface of the heart, we have the inferior vena cava. Now we've just got a little stump of it here, so I'm just poking my finger here to show you inferior vena cava. From areas below the heart, deoxygenated blood comes back through the inferior vena cava. From areas above the heart, blood comes in through the superior vena cava, both of which are going to empty into the right atrium. Now remember that right atrium is going to fill with blood. It goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then we're going to send it out to the lungs to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. All right, the next thing on your list of structures is your cardiac conduction system. Your cardiac conduction system is a little difficult to show on the models simply because it refers to a group of cells that are autorhythmic. These are the pacemaker of the heart. When you talked about muscle contraction in 201, remember the job of a muscle is to contract, right? So with your skeletal muscle, you should have heard about acetylcholine stimulating that muscle cell to contract because a neuron dumped it onto the receptors in the synapse. But all of that started because of a stimulus and a nerve cell, and then that muscle cell contracted because of something being put onto that cell. Well, these autorhythmic cells in the cardiac conduction system don't rely on the nervous system to contract. They generate their own depolarization. So cardiac conduction is a system, not necessarily a structure. Now there are structures that you could see if we really had some detailed models. So for my class, now remember, check with your instructor. For my class, the only thing that I will hold you responsible for seeing on the models for cardiac conduction are the last little pieces and parts, which are these little white fibers that are embedded in the myocardium. So you see along the walls of the ventricles, these little white fibers, these are the Purkinje fibers. So they send the depolarization out through the myocardium so that the ventricles contract once they're depolarized, and then the blood is pushed out. All right, now remember, check with your instructor so you know exactly what you are responsible for identifying on the lab models for cardiac conduction. Okay? Me personally, just the Purkinje fibers. Now you're going to need to know all of this for your lecture content, so it's good to understand these structures and what they're responsible for, but you'll get that in lecture. All right, now we're going to move on to the second page of your structures, and we'll begin with the chordae tendineae or chordae tendineae. You may hear this pronounced either way, and either one is usually acceptable. Let's go back to these atrioventricular valves. All righty? Now remember, these are between your atria and your ventricles, and they allow blood to leave the atria and go into your ventricles. But we don't want backflow. We don't want blood coming from your ventricles back into your atria. So your chordae tendineae, these little white strings that are attached to your valves, help to prevent that from happening. Okay, so your valves and then your chordae tendineae, and all of this are attached, or all of this is attached to papillary muscles that are finger-like projections of muscles that extend up from the area of the apex. Now these models typically don't show it really well, but here you can see just a bit of a papillary muscle and your chordae tendineae attached to that. Papillary muscles contract when the ventricles contract. So when the ventricles contract, they pull on the papillary muscles pull on the chordae tendineae, and your atrioventricular valves close so that blood goes out to the body and out to the lungs and not backflow up into your atria. All right, next we have your pulmonary trunk. Now think of this like a trunk of a tree. It's going to go up and branch off into smaller pieces. So this vessel, and let me close our chambers here, this vessel is the pulmonary trunk. Now you can see that it leads from the right ventricle, and pulmonary, remember, refers to the lungs. So this is going to be the main artery that's going to branch into left and right pulmonary arteries that are going to go out to the lungs, drop off that CO2, and in the capillary beds, pick up oxygen. So pulmonary trunk, left pulmonary artery, and the right pulmonary artery. In order to get into that pulmonary artery, we've got to go through a valve. So when that right ventricle contracts, we've got the pulmonary valve that regulates entry into the pulmonary trunk. This is one of your two semilunar valves. Okay, semilunar describes the shape, just like atrioventricular describes where these valves are. So this is your pulmonary semilunar valve. From the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, and then right and left pulmonary arteries. So far, so good? All right, let's look at the left side. Now remember, the left side is going to be responsible for sending oxygenated blood out to the body. So we've got a valve that's hidden. You really got to get tricky to see this one. So if you move the bicuspid valve out of the way and look deep into the chamber, deep into the ventricle, you'll see way up in there we have the aortic valve. That's also a semilunar valve. That aortic valve is the opening into the aorta. So the aorta is the vessel that's going to be responsible for bringing blood out to the body. So your pulmonary trunk and your aorta are arteries. Remember, A for artery, A for away, takes blood away from the heart. So on the left side, your left ventricle contracts, blood goes through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta and to the aortic arch. Now, when you get to the aortic arch, the blood has a decision to make. If it's going to go above the heart, it's got to take one of these three vessels. That lesson's coming. If it's going below the heart, it will go through the descending aorta and to one of the many branches of the descending aorta. All right, let's check our list. We've got our valves, we've got the aorta. Let's get those pulmonary veins. If we're going to take blood out to the heart, we've got to bring it back, or out to the lungs from the heart, we've got to bring it back. So that deoxygenated blood, remember, goes out through your pulmonary trunk to your pulmonary arteries, smaller pulmonary arterioles, pulmonary capillaries, pulmonary venules. Now we're in really tiny vessels that are going to merge to form pulmonary veins. So you have left pulmonary veins, there's two, and right pulmonary veins, there's two. Now even though this is on the right side, they're all four going to empty into the left atrium, bringing that deoxygenated blood back into the heart. Now remember I said a while ago that arteries take blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood back in to the heart. So V-E-I-N is vein, bring blood back in. Now you may notice the color on these are different from what you may think about with arteries and veins. You might have been taught in high school that arteries are red and veins are blue. Well, forget it. That's not why they're red and blue. They're red and blue because of the oxygen content. Red vessels are carrying oxygenated blood. Blue vessels are carrying deoxygenated blood. Now, so that red and blue may be true for all areas of the body, but when you're talking about your pulmonary arteries and veins, they're going to be the exception to that rule. Because remember, your pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood from the right side out to the lungs. Your pulmonary veins are bringing oxygenated blood back in from the lungs. So your pulmonary arteries and your pulmonary veins are the exception to the red-blue rule. Remember that. That trips a lot of people up on their lab test. Okay, so now we need to talk about the heart itself and the circulation that's responsible for supplying the myocardium. You have just a few vessels that you have to know, but they are very important vessels. Now, we've talked about the heart sending blood out to the lungs and the heart sending blood out to the body. Well, if all of this muscle is going to contract, it's got to have ATP. It's got to have nutrients. The blood doesn't diffuse from the inside of the heart out. Okay, so we got to have a circulatory system, a coronary circulation that's responsible for taking blood out to the myocardium. And that's exactly what we do have. And the heart is greedy. The heart gets blood first. So you're going to have right and left coronary arteries that are your first branches off this aorta once the blood comes back from the lungs and goes through the left side. So when blood goes through that aortic valve and into the ascending aorta, you've immediately got a little branch there. That is your right coronary artery. Now, if there's a right, you could assume there is a left, right? Of course. Now, you're only going to be able to see just a short little piece of this left coronary artery, because the rest of it is behind your pulmonary trunk. If we could take that pulmonary trunk and pull it out of the way, you would see that that short little stub right there connects right back up here to the aorta, or branches from that aorta. But as soon as this vessel branches, the name changes. So you see you got just a tiny little piece of it here. That is your left coronary artery. Here you have your right coronary artery. Your left coronary artery branches into your circumflex artery. Circumflex means to go around. So left coronary artery branches into circumflex artery. And then this one that runs down the front of the heart. Now this one you're going to see with two different names. The one that's in your lab guide is anterior, tells you front, interventricular, remember, between the ventricles, anterior interventricular artery. You may also hear this referred to as the descending artery, the left descending artery. But the one in your lab guide, which you'll be responsible for my lab test, is anterior interventricular artery. So once again, left coronary, circumflex, anterior interventricular. Those are the two branches that you need to know for your left coronary artery. On the right side, let's go back, close everything up. Right coronary artery. Your first branch, what's the margin of your paper? It's the edge, right? So we have the marginal artery down the edge of the heart. So the marginal artery is the branch that we're going to name. Now you see there are others. We're not naming those. Don't stress over them. Marginal artery. And then if you look at the posterior, the back, posterior surface of the heart, you'll see that right coronary artery is going to branch into the posterior, between the ventricles, interventricular artery. So once again, right coronary artery, marginal artery, down the edge, and your posterior interventricular artery. Now remember, arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. And that's still true, because we're carrying it away from the inside of the heart to the outside, so that we can take oxygen and nutrients out to the myocardium so those muscles can contract. But if we're going to do that, we're taking it out there to make ATP, right? Which means we got that old nasty waste product, CO2, we got to bring it back and get rid of it. So if we've got arteries taking it out, we've got to have veins bringing it back. And where are we going to bring it back to? Right atrium. You knew that. All right, so we've only got 3 of these vessels. And I often like to tell people, I think somebody swapped when they were naming, because you've got these beautifully descriptive vessels for your arteries. Anterior interventricular artery. Doesn't that just sound romantic? Yeah, I know, I'm a nerd. Circumflex artery. Posterior interventricular. Those are descriptive, beautiful names. Now look at the names of your veins. Great, middle, and small. I don't get it. It's one of my pet peeves. Can't help it. So let's name those 3 wonderful little veins. All right, so we got to bring that deoxygenated blood back, bring that CO2 back. The veins that we're going to use are the great cardiac vein. Okay, so it's going to be right there beside your anterior interventricular artery. The great cardiac vein is going to run also along the circumflex artery and back here to the back. Your middle cardiac vein is going to run beside your, what was that? Posterior interventricular artery. So your middle cardiac vein, bringing that deoxygenated blood back up here to this big old vessel, and your small cardiac vein running right beside your marginal artery, bringing blood back to this great big old vessel. Yep, it's got a name too. That large vessel that's collecting all of that deoxygenated blood, carrying all of that CO2, pulls it into one large vessel, empties it right back into the right atrium. All right, I know that sounds like a lot, but take it in chunks and learn the pieces and parts of this. Your instructor will cover this, but this video hopefully will help you to learn these structures a bit as well. See you next time.